Well, that was, fantastic. A great reminder that we do, in fact, worship a holy God. Give me a moment to get my technology sorted. There we go. So, as you might know, if you are a regular in this community, we are walking our way through the book of Judges, which is highly unusual, I think, for a church community to do. If you're visiting, you're like, oh, what am I here? Why am I doing? It's good. It is good, actually. Judges is being significantly redeemed for me. I've always had a very, I want to say ambivalent, but that's not true. It's not ambivalent. I just don't like this book. But that's been being changed, being challenged, and I'm grateful for that. So, Nick, just to prompt you, don't put this slide up just yet, this Gideon slide. We're going to look at the story of Gideon, but before the slide goes up, quiz time. What do you know about Gideon? Right, woolen, I heard like the fleece, the woolen fleece thing, right? You know that? We'll get into that in a moment. What else? Pardon me? That's funny. They put Bibles in hotel rooms. Yes, that is the Gideons, not this Gideon. All right. That's good. All right, what else do you know about Gideon, the character, the Bible character, other than the wool fleece thing, which is a bit strange. But what else? Incredible shrinking army. Yeah, that's one way to say that, right? Went from army of like 20,000 to 300. We'll look at that in a moment too. Came from a poor family. Yeah, I think that is accurate. He did tear down some idols. It's good that you know that, actually. We'll look at that as well. Here's what I have wondered about. So you can put that slide up. This is what he's mostly known for, right? He tests God with kind of laying out some wool fleece, and we'll look at that story a little bit more closely. And he defeats the Midianites, that happens to be the oppressors at the time, with 300 men. Now, most of our knowledge comes from Sunday school. We look at Gideon, kind of shows up in Sunday school stories. And then we don't usually go back to the story. So, and the way it's taught in Sunday school, I think, often, is Gideon's like a superhero. And it's like, with God's strength, he's going to defeat the Midianites. In fact, I remember when Daniel was little, we bought him the Superheroes Bible, and it's full of all these superhero stories and I'm sure there's a page on Gideon. Let me tell you, there's one hero in the Bible, okay? And it's not Gideon, it's Jesus. Okay, so I'm going to suggest to you that Gideon's not a hero story as much as a cautionary tale. And I want to revisit this story. It's been great. I've spent a lot of time with Gideon. He and I have had a lot of coffees this week. And he's really a fascinating character. So let me remind you that in the Judges cycle, remember there's this cycle, why don't I just read the text and you'll see the cycle. There's this repeating cycle in the book of Judges in the way that the story's told. And that the Israelites will do evil, and there's an oppressor that shows up and makes life very difficult, and they cry out to God. God then empowers a deliverer who then brings a time of peace, and then that cycle repeats. Okay, but if you'll notice also that Gideon is going to form a bit of a pivot here. If you look at that, he's one of the middle judges that gets talked about, and there's this movement from devotion, which is to some degree the people of Israel, larger degree the early judges. They were generally devoted to God, and as we go along, there's a decline in devotion, and then eventually a disintegration completely. And Gideon is going to form a bit of a pivot in the story, and you'll see that. He's quite a complex character, and there's a fair bit of information given here. And I would like to just, we'll make some observations, okay? So let me just give you the context. So it's Judges chapter 6, and I'll just read the first 5 verses for context. Here's how the author records it. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and other eastern people invaded the country. It's always eastern people. The eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and they ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. And they came up with their livestock and their tents like a swarm of locusts. Okay, biblical speak for there was lots of them. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravish it. The Midianites, this is how it concludes. It's kind of an ironic statement here. The Midianites so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Now, there's the context. You already begin to see that cycle repeat. The Israelites turn and do evil. The Midianites move in and they make life almost impossible for Israel, right? It's kind of a scorched earth policy where they ravish the land. Everything the Israelites plant or try and tend to gets completely destroyed. It's a siege mentality. They're just whittling away at the Israelites, making life untenable, impossible to do. And that cycle continues. And we could say a lot about this statement. It took them, like the author says, for 7 years. And you kind of think, why did it take them 7 years to cry out? We'll get back to that in a moment. But what's interesting, if you keep reading, is Gideon's take on it. So that's how the author describes what's going on. In verse 13, you get Gideon's take on what's going on. So God appears to Gideon, and Gideon's response is this. So again, some irony in the story, as you'll see. This is verse 12. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Verse 13. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring you out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us to the hand of Midian." So the chapter begins with the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Israelites had abandoned God. Gideon's interpretation is that God has abandoned Israel. Do you see how radically different those two perspectives are? Okay, that's sort of Gideon's start point. Is sort of a complete misunderstanding of what's actually going on. Let me walk you briefly through the story, and I'm just going to pull out 3 things. I want to say just 3 observations, and I'm going to circle back at the end to one of them. Okay? The first observation is this, and it sort of already comes out in Gideon's misunderstanding of the situation, is that the problem is often much deeper than we realize. Okay, the Israelites were crying out for deliverance. The Midianites were in the land making life impossible, and they cried out what they wanted was the Midianites to go away. Okay, that was the problem. At least that's what they thought the problem was. The problem was actually much deeper. The problem was idolatry. Okay, it's sort of like I have dandelions in my backyard. You might too. I have a lot. And I've been fighting this low-lying war with them for about 6 years. And, there is one way to go about it is to get a mower and mow your grass short, right? And then the dandelions disappear for a little while. But they come back with a vengeance, as it turns out. And so you really have to do the deep work of digging down to get their roots out. And that's what Israel's failing to see here. They want the Midianites. They want God to come across with a mower and get rid of the Midianites. The dandelions on the surface. But the problem that actually is facing the Israelites is much, much, much deeper. And it's instructive to me that the very first thing that Gideon does, as was pointed out, is he tears down some altars. If you go on into the story, so after he's got this, he has his interaction with God, and then God says, basically asks him to worship, which we've just done, and then I'll pick the story up in chapter 6, verse 25. That same night, the Lord said to Gideon, take a second bull from your father's herd, one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal. Okay, Baal is a foreign god, and cut down the Asherah pole. Also, so they're idols. They're places of worship to false gods. And build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as an offering. And Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him, because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night, not during the daytime. Okay, the problem is much deeper. Right? It took the Israelites, at least the way the story is recorded, 7 years. They put up with the Midianites. They put up with that before they cry out to God. And then when they do cry out to God, the first thing that Gideon is actually called to do is tear down an altar in his backyard. Right? I'm not surprised he's afraid of his family and the town folk. He's challenging his very family structure and the fabric of his town. They've so orientated themselves to false idols that he's like, I'm going to do this at night in case I get found out, which he does. That part goes all right. But it's a significant risk that he takes this on. But the problem is often much deeper. Okay? So that's the first observation, that Israel, they kind of just want the surface dandelions. God always is interested in the roots. Caleb talked about this. It comes out in Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, don't murder, right? It's important. Don't murder, right? That's kind of an external. But Jesus is concerned about, don't hate, that inner root. The problem is often much deeper, and here too, the problem is much deeper. First observation. Second observation is that we are not as strong as we think we are. And this comes out in spades in Gideon. It's the irony of how God shows up as a mighty warrior. As God shows up and calls Gideon a mighty warrior. And he's anything but that. If you follow through that early interaction, I kind of skipped over it, but if you go back into that story, he's constantly making excuses why he shouldn't be called by God. In fact, there's some parallel here between Gideon's call and Moses' call, the burning bush, and Moses too makes a lot of excuses. There is a little difference though, as Moses calls his own abilities into question, like I don't have a very good voice and I'm not a very good speaker and this and that and the other thing. Gideon, if you look carefully at his excuses, he starts there, but then he actually calls God into question. Can you actually do this, God, really? And that's where you know the story of the fleeces. Well, if you can do this, God, if you actually are true to your word, I'm going to put this wool out here. And if the wool's wet and the ground's dry in the morning, then I'll know that you're true to your word. And that's how it plays out. The wool's wet and the ground's dry. But he actually tests God a second time on this because it's like, duh, of course the wool's going to be wet. It's going to evaporate slower than the ground. So he thinks probably natural phenomenon. And in the tail end of chapter 6, Gideon says to God, do not be angry. Let me just make one more request. And he even calls it out. He knows what he's doing. Allow me one more time to test you with this fleece. But this time make the fleece dry and the ground wet. Now, I want to come back to this point in a moment, so I'm not going to develop it much here. But what I want you to actually notice is the fact that we're not as strong as we think we are is not a surprise to God. Okay? And what's beautiful in this story, and I would invite you to really pay attention to this, is how God changes, shifts. He adjusts to work with Gideon. He anticipates Gideon's fear and is willing to meet him there. Okay? And it's most clearly seen in chapter 7. In the early stages in this call, God is calling Gideon, and Gideon's the one saying, well, God, I don't believe you. Show me a sign numerous times. When it comes time for the battle, God anticipates Gideon's fear and offers him a sign before he even asks for it. It's really a beautiful moment. And it also is a high point of the story because it's this super, you got to read this. It's so bizarre. All right, so it's chapter 7. I'm going to pick it up at verse 9. All right, so Gideon's assembled, we'll come back to parts of the story. I'm jumping around, but I just want you to notice this. So picking up at verse 9. During the night, the Lord said to Gideon, now God is taking the initiative here. Get up, go down to the camp, because I'm going to give the Midianites into your hands. If you are afraid, you are afraid. If you are afraid, God says, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and listen to what they're saying. Afterwards, you'll be encouraged, right? You see the compassion, the mercy of God. God meets Gideon in his frailty, in his weakness. But I want to read the whole story. So he and Purah, the servant, went down to the camp. Midianites, Amalekites, and all the other eastern people were settled there, thick as locusts. They couldn't count the camels, like lots of emphasis on how many there were. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling him in his dream. This is great. I had a dream. A round barley loaf of bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. Okay, just close your eyes and just picture it for a moment, okay? A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force, the tent fell over and collapsed, okay? So a big dinner roll comes bouncing in and knocks over the guy's tent, right? Like, picture it. Now, this is great. His friend responds, this can be none other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash. God has given the Midianites the whole camp into his hands. And I'm like, what? You're at a dream about a loaf of bread and it's clear to you that's Gideon? I'm like, I'm clearly missing something here. It's great. But notice, what I really just want you to notice is that God meets Gideon, okay? He's not as strong as he thinks he is. He's actually quite fearful, repeated times, and God is compassionate. God is gracious. God meets him there. Okay, second observation. I want to come back to that point in a moment. The third observation, and the thing that's probably most known about this story, Mark, you pointed out, is that God whittles down the Israelite army. Like, when they first set up in chapter 7, there's a sense of symmetry. There's the Midianites on one side of the field, and there's thousands of them. And then there's the Israelites on the other side of the field, and there's thousands of them. And let me just read to you the first part of chapter 7, the story. So early in the morning, Gideon and all his men camped around the spring of Harod, I guess. The camp of Midian was to the north, right? There's this symmetrical armies lining up. And the Lord said to Gideon, you've got too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands. Or Israel would boast against me, saying, my own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left. And 10,000 remained. So we had 32,000 in the army, 22,000, 2/3 of them left because they were afraid, just like Gideon was afraid, right? And yet they're able to acknowledge their fear. And then the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water and I'll thin them out there for you. And if I say this one goes with you, he shall go. And if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told them, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. So you got those who kneeling down at the river, drinking from the river like with their face, I guess. And others who kind of scoop it up with their hands and kind of lap it out of their hands. And of the people that you cup hands and kind of lap up the water, 300 of them drank like that. And the rest went down to their knees to drink. And then the Lord said to Gideon, with these 300 men, I will save you. And as the story unfolds, 300 people defeat this the army from Midian, the Midianites. God defeats them. Now remember, the author has gone to great pains to tell you they couldn't even count their camels. This was a large army, right? Lots of emphasis on that. And also emphasis on the fact that Gideon had 300 people. And the point, and God makes it very clear, the point is it's going to be so asynchronistic, like it's going to be so out of whack that the only possible conclusion can be that deliverance comes from God. Okay, that's what God's setting up here. There's no possible way that the Israelites could brag about this story. And what God does is he thins the army out in such a way that they're just left with these 300. Okay, and what God is challenging, it's very clear in verse 2. What God is challenging is the myth of self-sufficiency, that we can do it on our own. That's what has got Israel into trouble all this time and time again. That's why they repeat the cycle, as we'll see in a moment. Because they go it on their own. They think, oh, we don't need God. And they turn their back on God, or God's not that exciting, or God's irrelevant. We'll do it our own way. We can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. Do you hear echoes of that in our world, perhaps? And this is what's happening here too. And God is making it very clear you can't actually get there on your own. The problem is deeper than you realize, and you're not as strong as you think you are. Therefore, you actually need me to deliver you. And in verse 2, he makes this very clear. I've read it. Let me reread it. You have too many men. I cannot deliver Israel or Midian into Israel's hands, or Israel would boast. My own strength has saved me. And what God wants to make abundantly clear is that self-sufficiency and independence are a myth. It's a bit of a smokescreen. We're not as strong as we think we are. As the battle unfolds, these 300 men cause panic in the Midianite camp, and the Midianites actually turn on them themselves. Quick Lord of the Rings analogy, if you've watched the movie or read the book. This happens in the tower of, at the top of, thank you. It's the top of the pass, and the orcs turn on themselves. And so Sam single-handedly defeats the power of that tower, but it's an analogy to this story, actually. Right? It's not Sam that did it. It's God that does these things. And these are sort of the themes that Tolkien, I digress. Anyway, what Gideon actually, and this has been the most illuminating for me as I've spent my week with Gideon, getting to know him a bit, is Gideon is not a hero in the story. Gideon is a cautionary tale, or perhaps better said, it's a tale, it's an honest examination of human frailty. And it's really, this story is a gift to the people of God. Okay? A gift to you. It really is fascinating. When we first meet Gideon, he's fearful and he's very unsure of himself, and he's unsure of God. That becomes very clear if you read chapter 6. He questions God's ability to do what God says he'll do. He questions God's word, his promises. He questions his own ability. He's fearful. But counterintuitively, this fear, this uncertainty in him, this weakness, makes him dependent on God. And the New Testament unpacks this theme. We could pause here for a long, long time. This is a very important theme. But I'll just read probably the best known verse on this, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. I might back it up a bit. But this is Paul writing to his Corinthian friends, and he's talking about how he's got this thorn in the flesh. That's not clear what that is, but he's got this thing that's causing him pain, weakness, frustration, making him unsure. I don't know. And he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Take away my weakness, right? But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's what's going on with Gideon in the early stages of the Gideon story. He's very unsure, he's weak, he's frail, and yet God empowers him. God is willing to work with that. Okay, so in counterintuitively, it's his weakness, not his strength, not his hero abilities, that make him a good judge or a good leader in this moment. It is his weakness, it's vulnerability that make him dependent on God. Okay, and it's a really important theme in Scripture that our weakness is what God works with and where God meets us. But notice, if you were to follow the story, we haven't got into chapter 8, but as you get into the tail end of chapter 7 of Judges, now back to Judges and Gideon, if we get into the story in the tail end of chapter 7 and then chapter 8, where the story of Gideon concludes, it actually ends pretty badly. And this is where Gideon pivots. By the end of the battle, things begin to go sideways. And it's really interesting to observe. As the story goes on, God begins to fade from view. In chapter 6, there's lots of conversation with God. By chapter 8, God's hardly mentioned at all. God slips from view, and the story becomes about Gideon. Right? And self-sufficiency begins to rear its head again. And look how great I am. Oh yeah, look, I defeated the Midianites. And in chapter... Well, there's already a hint of this in the tail end of chapter 7, where after the Midianite army is put into confusion by the 300, Gideon calls other Israelites back into the war. And it's very unclear if God wanted him to do that or not. It's very ambivalent. The text is not clear on whether God wants that. But Gideon calls in a bunch of other Israelites to come and really defeat and rout the Midianites. And then in chapter 8, beginning that verse 1, the Ephraimites, another tribe, come out and say to Gideon, "Why have you treated like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And Gideon, he does some pretty good diplomacy here to kind of, talk these guys off the ledge. But he never claims that, it wasn't me, it was God who did it. And he's beginning to take credit for the battle. The story goes on, and as he's chasing the Midianites, he comes across these two small towns. His men are hungry and thirsty, and he asks for help. And the towns are like, "No, we're not so sure about this." Interesting enough, the very posture Gideon had at the beginning of the story, these towns now exhibit. It's almost identical. We don't know. We'll wait to see. They're just hedging their bets a little bit. And Gideon gets really mad at them and says, After I capture these kings, I'm going to come back and teach you guys a lesson, which he does. He comes back, and it's very clear that he takes revenge on these towns. Then Gideon came to the men of Succoth, this is in chapter 8, verse 15, and he said, "Here are these two leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna, whatever, those guys. How about whom you taunted me? Yeah, you taunted me." And he took the leaders, the elders of the town, and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars, whatever that means. Threw them into the thorns. I don't know. And then he pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. This is the first time in the book of Judges Israelites kill Israelites. It's a turning point in the story. And you begin to see Gideon losing his way. He began out somewhat promising. He's weak, he's frail, and yet God meets him there and works with him and empowers him and uses him. But as soon as he begins he loses his sense of dependence on God and starts depending on his own strength and ingenuity, and I think I can handle this. He calls other Israelites into the battle, and there's a bloodbath, and then he starts taking revenge on his own people. And then the story's not quite over yet. Then they say, "Well, Gideon, look how great you are. Why don't we make you king?" And he says, No, I don't really want to be king. But I'll tell you what, why don't you give me a bunch of the treasure that you've captured? And he makes an ephod, or an ephod, however you say that word. An ephod that's not an English word, it's a Hebrew word. It's best as I could figure out, it's a priestly garment. It's like a cool coat with some jewels on it and stuff. Priests wear it or wore it to offer sacrifices. It's a cool thing, I guess. And he makes one of these, and listen what happens here. Gideon made the gold that they donated to him into an ephod, into this robe, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. He places it in his town. Remember the town where his dad had an idol in the backyard? Now listen. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping the ephod there. and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. At the beginning of the story, Gideon is an idol breaker. And by the end of the story, he is an idol maker. Do you see how he's just so clearly lost his way? I want to talk about that tiny bit more, but I want to not miss the next verse, right? So literally the next verse. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping there, right? They've turned to evil again. Listen to the very next verse. Verse 28 of chapter 8. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. And during Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. Despite the Israelites' constant turning away from God, God is gracious to them. Do you see the mercy of God? It's the last time in the book of in Judges that the land has rest. This is the gift that God gives, even in the midst of their unfaithfulness. God gives them rest. But what Gideon teaches us, or reminds us, as I've spent time with him, is he failed to guard his heart against the temptations and the illusions of power. Again, this is why I love the story of Lord of the Rings. It is a fascinating exploration of power and the use of power, right? It's the ring of power, and everybody wants it. And there are only a few that are afraid to touch it, afraid to use it, because they know that power will turn the story sideways. But it's a fascinating exploration, as is the story of Gideon, a fascinating exploration of human frailty and how our weakness, counterintuitively, is the gift that draws us to God. And as we start operating in our own strength and our own ingenuity, and our own sense of powerfulness, the story starts going sideways. And what Gideon moves is from dependence on God to self-sufficiency. I don't need God anymore. I think I can start making decisions on my own, because look how successful I was. And this, friends, is not an ancient story. This isn't a story stuck 4,000 years ago. This is our story. This is my story. If you ever really want a depressing sort of couple hours, here's how you can get that. You can Google pastors who fell from grace. Okay, and you'll get a myriad of stories of high-profile pastors that were caught usually, not always, but usually in some sort of sexual indiscretion. And I'm not going to name them. I'm not looking to cast stones. Most of these are well known in sort of like in pastor circles, or in sort of they're, loosely celebrity pastors. They're well known people. And it might not hit you the same way. Maybe it's because I'm a pastor and it's like, oh gosh, I don't know. If you're a teacher and you read about teacher indiscretions, maybe that would hit you. I don't know how that would. But most of these pastors I haven't known. But 3 of them I have, actually. And again, I'm not going to name them. That's not appropriate. And one of them are actually a close friend of mine. I was at his wedding. I watched him walk down the aisle. I witnessed him say vows to his wife that he meant. Guaranteed, he meant those vows. And 4 or 5 years later, he is embroiled in multiple affairs. And it's tragic. The story is tragic. It's like Gideon's story. There's a tragedy to that story arc. It begins kind of not so, and it gets good, and then it gets really bad. But that's actually not what challenges me. The challenges me is not that happened. The challenge is that could happen to me. I'm not beyond that. And that shouldn't surprise you. And if you're honest, you're not beyond it either. Because we're frail. It's not like Gideon was a bad guy. Gideon was frail and failed to hold his frailty before God. Failed to remember that he was frail. The issue isn't that we're weak. The issue is we think we're not weak. And when we start thinking like that, we kind of like, we maybe just, we grow a little complacent. And affairs, at least the friends I've known that have landed there, they don't happen overnight. They're just kind of a series of small decisions, all of which I'm capable of. And then one day they're way over here. And this is Gideon. It's just a series of small things. You can begin to see his downward spiral as God begins to slip from view and become a lot less in the story and a lot less for Gideon. And Gideon becomes a lot more. And it's very insightful at one point in the New Testament story when they're gathering around John the Baptist, who's got quite a following. And John the Baptist says the exact opposite. He says, he, Jesus, must become greater, and I must become less. Right? This is where Gideon fell apart. It's Gideon should become greater. Hey, Gideon, you should be our king. Yeah, well, that sounds good. And God becomes less. It's a cautionary tale. And I invite you to see yourself there. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just trying to be honest. Nothing in this story should surprise us. Gideon's a human. And I have that in common with him. And his frailty is my frailty. But frailty isn't the problem. Frailty can be a gift because it can draw us to Jesus, right? My grace, Jesus says, is sufficient. And my power is made perfect in your weakness. And this is where I want to leave the story, that this isn't the final word. Chapter 8, by the end of chapter 8, Gideon passes away. But it's not the last time Gideon shows up in the biblical narrative, remarkably. After everything I've said to you about Gideon, he shows up in Hebrews chapter 11, which is, we've often called it sort of the heroes of the faith. I want to sort of maybe recast that a little bit. But men and women who have certainly been journeying with God. And if you were to read Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm going to pick it up at verse 32, the author has already talked about Joseph and Abraham and Moses and all kinds of things. And then he's just tripping over himself, or she maybe. And what more shall I say? The author says, I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson even, Jephthah. Man, this is not a good list. And David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms and administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. That's the story of Gideon we've just looked at. And this author places Gideon in this cloud of witnesses of God's faithfulness. And this is the final word. It's not human frailty, it's God's grace. The final word on Gideon isn't that he was just a crappy guy and too bad he ended badly. The final word on Gideon is God is gracious and met him in his weakness and used him nonetheless. As Isabel Hamley, who I've been reading quite a lot of, commentator, writes, Gideon is remembered as a deliverer and a man of faith despite his shortcomings. A memory that shapes the community, us, in grace and in hope. Because human frailty is never the last word. God's grace is the last word. I'm going to pray, but then I actually want to invite you into a time of prayer. So I'm going to invite the worship team they're going to kind of be getting into their spaces behind me. And we're just going to open up a space to pray. And what I would invite you into is perhaps it's a prayer of confession. An acknowledgement that you've been relying too much on your own strength, your own wisdom, that God has faded from view. Just be honest. I'm not asking you to speak that out loud. I'm asking you to speak that to God. But be honest. Has God slipped from view? Are you living in chapter 8 of the book of Judges where you're kind of pretty confident on your own strength, your own abilities, your own successes, that God is rarely consulted? So maybe it's a prayer of confession. And I invite you to pray that God longs to hear that. Or maybe it's a prayer of reaffirmation that we actually are dependent and need to be dependent on God. You recognize that and you just want to speak that out again. You're maybe in the earlier part of the story of Joshua and you recognize that the stuff in your life is way bigger than you and you can't handle it. And you're in that part of the Gideon narrative when you're just crying out to God saying, I don't think I can do this, but God help me. I want to depend on you. Maybe you're in that part. Wherever you find yourself, just bring that before God. So you're invited to pray while these songs are going on. You can pray in your seats. You're welcome to come to these kneelers. If you want, I'll sit up front. I can pray with you. I don't know, Caleb can maybe come sit up front. He can pray with you. You can just find some space to pray. Or you can use these songs as your prayer. They are carefully chosen songs as a response. And the songs themselves can be your prayer. So you could sing along or just listen along. But friends, this is just a time for you to be before God. Open, honest. And just let God know where you are and where you'd like him to be. Let me pray and then I'll head off. God, I thank you for the story of Gideon, which has surprised me this week. This story is so nuanced and so honest. And I can find myself in this story. God, you know, better than anyone in this room, you know how frail I am. And it doesn't come as a surprise. And each of us are that. There are things we can do, and there's things that we think we can do, and there's things we certainly cannot do. And I don't always get those categories right, but you are pretty clear on them. And so you invite us to come with our abilities and our insecurities, with the things we can do and the things we cannot. You invite us into a posture of dependence. So come, Lord, hear our prayer. In your mercy, hear our prayer.